I'm delighted that Dr. Brad Roberts has been able to join us, and I think the subject is particularly important for looking forward to the next US BMD review. You've got Dr. Brad Roberts' CVs with you. He's the Director for the Center for Global Security Research at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. But importantly, he was, for 4 years, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and Nuclear Missile Defense Policy in the US Department of Defense. In that, he was the Policy Director for the Obama administration's Nuclear Posture Review and BMD Review. In his CV also, you'll see some of his recent publications. But anticipating the 2017 US Ballistic Missile Defense Review, over to you, Brad.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you for this hardy group that stayed until the bitter end of a long 2 days. Your reward is that I'm not using PowerPoint, so I hope that helps enliven the conversation a little bit. I want to underscore that I'm speaking in my personal capacity. I'm not representing the interests of Lawrence Livermore Laboratory or the Department of Energy or the US government or anybody in any campaign. I'm just doing my own thinking about this set of questions, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to get my thinking together for this discussion. So the topic is looking ahead a year from now to the new presidential administration in the United States, which will conduct a review of missile defense policy and posture. Whether it's exactly a ballistic missile defense review, I'll come back to that. But about a year from now, there will be a team assembling in Washington. Remember that it takes a while for teams to assemble after the president has been sworn in, a matter of months. It took us from January until June 1st to have a full set of political appointees in the Office of the Secretary of Defense in 2009. So it's not really quite clear when the review will start or how long it will run or how it will be scoped. But as I've thought about the issues it will have to address, I've set out the following framework. I think there will be 5 main elements of this review. The first element will be the threat environment. And of course, this will be an intelligence-driven assessment of both the current environment and trends in the environment. And we've already in this last panel had a splendid exploration of the way in which the regional threat is evolving and the intercontinental range capabilities are developing, particularly in North Korea. We've talked a little bit about the advancements in countermeasures that countries are developing. But essentially, it's an environment marked by an increase in capability in the hands of countries that concern us and an increasing quality of capability in their hands. And of course, a good intelligence-based assessment will also highlight the fact that there's a significant new dimension of cruise missile proliferation in this overall missile environment, both conventionally armed, principally conventionally armed, but also some nuclear armed. And a part of the purpose of conducting a threat assessment is to look ahead. The Ballistic Missile Defense Review, of which I was a co-leader, was specifically mandated to look ahead 8 to 10 years. If you're a new president coming in, your working assumption is you're going to be reelected in 4 years, and you've got an eight-year time period to get some business done, and you want to look a little beyond that. So 8 to 10 years. We looked ahead at the threat in 2009, 8 to 10 years, and the ICBM threat coming from North Korea and Iran had sort of paused. And this gave us an opportunity to pause in the deployments of the GBIs, fix some problems in them, hedge against the possible renewal of progress by North Korea and Iran, and then, of course, the implementation of the hedge a little later. The new team a year from now will look ahead 8 to 10 years. They'll have to confront the probability that North Korea is going to move into serial production of nuclear-armed intercontinental range ballistic missiles. That's a problem we didn't face. There will be a big open question about whether in the 8 to 10 year time frame, Iran might do the same, or at least field non-nuclear tipped intercontinental range ballistic missiles. And of course, a sound intelligence assessment will also highlight the fact that Russia and China are continuing to work very hard and put a lot of money into the assured penetration of U.S. missile defenses. A second main component of the review will be a review of the program of record, both what's in the current budget and looking ahead over the 5 years of the 5-year defense plan. What that review will reveal is that, of course, the program of record will conclude in 2017 the building up of the GBIs to 44. It will include a commitment to continue to upgrade and modernize, to seek performance improvements in the GBIs. A program review will look at the hedge. Recall that the hedge was a serious problem for us in 2009 as we thought about the possibility that Iran and North Korea might rapidly renew progress on ICBMs. We were seized with the question of how could we ensure that we would stay ahead of that emerging threat. So we left the possibility of going from 30, 36 to 44, but we also began to think about additional deployment options as a possible hedge. And so the hedge that's now in place, which is preparing for an East Coast missile field and maybe a missile field elsewhere in the country, if a future need arises, will be re-examined. And on regional missile defense, the program of record will show a plan to buy additional radars and interceptors and to begin to field in the 5-year time plan the SM-32A. A third element of the review, money, the budget. Ballistic missile defense spending has, of course, been hostage to the general problem of defense spending and budget paralysis in the United States. Ballistic missile defense spending, since we conducted the Missile Defense Review and projected steady or growing investments, since that period, there's been steady decline. From approximately $10 billion to approximately $8 billion, approximately 14% since 2008, with a significant hit in the last year of a 10% reduction at a time when the defense budget shrank only 4%. Now, it depends on what you count, and you can count different things, but this gives you the overall picture. And of course, the reduced spending has come at the expense of research and development and future capability. The money has gone out of R&D and into procurement. And I think the next team is going to have a big debate about whether $8 billion is the right level and whether $10 billion should be the right level or something higher. They'll have a debate about whether the Budget Control Act, well, they won't have a debate. Our election will either solve the political problem and move us beyond the Budget Control Act or perpetuate it. Who knows? And I think they'll have a debate about whether to rebalance spending on procurement versus R&D. Fourth element of the review, the politics of missile defense. 8 years ago, we inherited a situation of a lot of political division over missile defense. That was part of the Congress chartered the Ballistic Missile Defense Review in 2008. And part of their purpose was in trying to force a national discussion about was there anything we could agree about in national ballistic missile defense policy. This coming election will either settle that question or reopen that question. It's hard to tell. The legacy we leave as an administration is a degree of bipartisanship on missile defense policy that's been rare in national politics. To be sure, there are lots of different ideas about what else missile defense might do. But the main contours of the missile defense policy set out in 2009 enjoy a striking degree of support across the members of the Armed Services Committees and the appropriators in both parties. Now, if there's a landslide election for one candidate or another, new things may look possible. If we produce gridlock again, nothing may look possible. Who knows? But that will be a part of the calculus because it will inform what you think you can get away with on the budget, what you think you can get away with in breaking new grounds on policy. The fifth element and final big element of the review is the policy piece. The obvious point of departure will be a review of the policy priorities set out in 2009. And since I'm sure not all of you could recite them word for word, if given the quiz, let me just do so. And listen with the thought of what might somebody want to throw out or change in 2017. First priority, to defend the American homeland from limited attacks. Second, to defend against regional threats to U.S. forces while protecting allies and partners and enabling them to defend themselves. Third priority, to test new capabilities under realistic operating conditions before deploying them. Fourth, to ensure new capabilities are fiscally sustainable for the long term. Fifth, to ensure flexibility in the capabilities so that in our changed and changing world, we have the ability to reassemble an architecture in light of changes. And sixth, to lead expanded international efforts for missile defense. Now, in a circumstance in which we have a strong measure of bipartisanship, you can expect, by and large, agreement about that list of priorities. You know, every new administration gets its own strategic vocabulary. It will re-express some of the ideas in certain ways. It may throw out a couple of those priorities as kind of out of date. It may have some new priorities of its own. But by and large, that framework seems to be uncontested by any of the significant political actors currently on the American political landscape. But I think we can expect some significant policy debate about how to implement our commitments, and let me highlight a few key issues on the first two priorities. So the first priority is about defending the American homeland from limited ballistic missile attacks. And there are a number of questions that might come up, but let me highlight two for purposes here today. Defend the American homeland from limited ballistic missile attack. In 2009, and we said we're going to do that by staying ahead, maintaining our currently advantageous position vis-a-vis the threat. 2009, the advantageous position was 30 to 0. That's a good advantageous position for homeland ballistic missile defense. Interceptors in the ground versus long-range nuclear-tipped ICBMs in North Korea or Iran. But if my guesstimate is right and North Korea moves into serial production at some point in the 8 to 10 year period, staying ahead is going to get hard. Particularly if North Korea and Iran jump in at more or less the same time, and particularly if they decide they might export capabilities. So staying ahead with our protection against limited strikes to the American homeland didn't look all that challenging in 2009. I think it's going to look more challenging in 2017. This will invite questions about how to hedge. And there is a strong constituency for going on the East Coast missile field as just an idea in the future to actually spring-loading the process so that if we get an intelligence assessment that clearly indicates North Korea's crossed into serial production, we can go not in a matter of a decade, but in a matter of a couple of years to having additional GBIs deployed. The East Coast missile field obviously would be more relevant to the Iranian decision to do that than the North Korean one. So I think you'll see the next review commit to the continued expansion, updating, modernization, and improvement of the GMD system. I think you'll see a lot more discussion of how to hedge and a bigger emphasis on left of launch. And I'm sure you all know what that means, so I won't worry about elaborating. Second big policy question on homeland defense against limited attacks is about Russia and China. I don't think there's really any debate, there are pockets of debate, about turning the homeland defense system against China. There is a debate about that, but no real political appetite for doing so. The problem is of a somewhat different kind. In 2009, we offered some assurances to Moscow and Beijing. We said quite explicitly that the United States does not seek the capability to defeat large-scale strikes of which they are capable, and the capabilities we seek are not intended to undermine strategic stability with them. To both Russia and China, we made an offer of dialogues on strategic stability, dialogues about missile defense. Neither found our claims about seeking limited defense to be credible. Neither was interested in a strategic stability dialogue, especially not China. Neither was assured by the reassurance. And so they're both working very hard to ensure that not only do they maintain the ability to penetrate the defense, but that we don't, in some secret, backhanded way, turn our missile defense cooperation with our allies into a strategy of encirclement and containment and color revolution, which is their association of missile defense. So in 2017, I think there will be a debate in the policy community in Washington about should we continue to try and reassure Moscow and Beijing? Does strategic stability still matter to us in the way we said it did? Is limited still the right answer? I think you'll see all of those debates, and at the end of the day, not much change from the current approach because the alternatives are not very palatable. But I think we, the United States, will have to do a better job than we've done of assessing whether the responses that Russia and China have made in their strategic postures and continue to make, that they defend as because we forced them to do it with our missile defense, we'll have to determine whether we're really comfortable with the changes they're making or not. The second of two priorities from the review that I want to elaborate a little bit about, the policy dimension, is the priority number 2, to defend against regional threats while protecting allies and partners and enabling them to defend themselves. I think there are going to be 3 hot topics here, among a number, but 3 to be sure. First and foremost, is this whole enterprise for regional missile defense a fool's errand? We have people in our system who argue that it is, that this is a cost-imposing strategy that China and Russia and Iran and North Korea have tricked us into playing. And we're going to spend more and more of our ever more scarce resources competing to crank out defense while they spend a little bit of money to crank out offense. And do we really need to keep doing this with them? And is this just a fool's errand? I think we're going to have that discussion. That discussion tends to be driven by our services, who would rather spend the money on something else, thank you very much. And the combatant commanders and our allies tend to have a very different view. So this will be a lively discussion with a lot of stakeholders. Second big question. In Northeast Asia, where do we go with regional missile defense? You heard 2 splendid presentations by 2 American allies who barely mentioned each other and who almost never mentioned China. What we have in Northeast Asia is 3 separate, sort of complementary, but separate approaches aimed at one problem, North Korea. And we have an American approach in the region which is also about China's theater missiles. And that's worked fairly well. You could see the capability development that's underway, the operational cooperation that's underway. There's a lot that's been accomplished in that framework. Look ahead 8 to 10 years. Is that going to work well enough for us? And imagine the question that comes when you go from the SM-3 1A and 1B to the SM-3 2A. What comes? China comes. Is this regional missile defense about China or not? That question is going to be on the table. U.S. policy, Obama administration says when it comes to regional missile defense, absolutely it's about China. Not about homeland defense, but yes, about regional. Are Japan and South Korea prepared to sign up to that proposition? Kind of uncomfortably, I don't know. So you can imagine some sensitive questions there. Third and final big question in this area is about the future of European missile defense. We've gone through EPA phases 1, 2, and we're nearly done with 3. 4 went away. What next? Do you just thicken EPAA? What next? What, after all, does the JCPOA mean to the European Missile Defense Project? There will be a debate about that. There will also be a debate about where Russia fits into this topic. And I know you had some discussion of this yesterday. Russia, of course, so this is Russia and regional missile defense, not Russia and American homeland defense. Russia and regional missile defense. In 2009, this was a non-question. There was no Russian regional missile threat to Europe. Russia wasn't an enemy. It hadn't fielded anything more than token capabilities, short and medium range. Very different landscape today. So as uncomfortable as the question is, we're going to debate. What about missile defense? What about regional missile defense and Russia? What are the simple options available to NATO on this question? No reaction to Russian missile deployments? Offense-dominant reaction? Offense-defense reaction? These are the 3 real choices. And if they are to choose offense-defense, what nature of defense? Well, one option would be to say EPAA phase, whatever you want to call it, 4 or 5, is now about providing territorial defense of NATO members from Russia. Personally, I think that's a bridge way too far. That's not going to happen. And we shouldn't squander the benefit of the territorial defense capability for the alliance from threats from the Middle East. So, but somebody will advocate for that. Another option is to do the job as a national contribution from those who feel a particular stake in this problem. I have more of a preference for this. And let me just lay out the case a little bit. Russia has set out 3 levels of war in its doctrine: strategic, regional, local. It describes a role for nuclear weapons in all 3, and it describes a role for missiles, both ballistic and cruise, in all 3. When we talk about strategic stability with Russia and not threatening the stable nuclear relationship, we're really talking about the strategic level. At the regional level of war, Russia has thought long and hard about the problem of deterring and defeating a conventionally superior nuclear-armed major power and its allies, a formulation, by the way, that's identical to the one that the Chinese use. And in their thinking about this, they attribute a significant role to anti-access area denial strategies and capabilities, and to conducting attacks sufficient to motivate de-escalation by NATO, but not so grievously damaging to NATO that there's no political basis for de-escalating. They're trying to find some sweet spot there. And A2AD strategies are aimed basically at keeping America from projecting conventional power effectively. And if we can protect projecting American forces projecting into Europe, we go a long way towards negating the Russian strategy as it's developed for regional conflict in Europe. So I think there's an argument for ballistic missile defense protection of APODs and SPODs for American conventional forces redeploying to Europe. And that's not a job that NATO as such needs to do, and it's not a job that the United States needs to say is just about Russia. It's about anywhere we're going to deploy conventional force. So, a closing argument. I've talked about the next ballistic missile defense review. There may not be a next ballistic missile defense review. One of the first questions the next administration will ask is, do we need to repeat that entire architecture of studies that the Obama administration did? The Congress requires a review of defense strategy every 4 years, the QDR. The Congress required the nuclear posture reviews of 2000 one in 2009. It's not clear it's going to require one next year. The Congress required the first and only ever ballistic missile defense review. The Obama administration went on to do cyber policy review, space policy review, a quadrennial diplomacy and development review, 8 or 9 different studies. And then with our allies, we did the deterrence and defense posture review and some similar bilateral activities in Northeast Asia. Is that the architecture we want to repeat exactly? Does that provide for the needed integration of capabilities, the needed trade-offs among capability sets to ensure that we're enhancing our posture? I don't think so. So it wouldn't surprise me if we see a different approach next year of some kind, and it wouldn't surprise me if we see the same approach, just because it's hard to figure out a different one. So in closing, and sorry to have gone on a tad too long, looking ahead to a year from now, a new presidential administration will in some way conduct a review of missile defense policy, not just ballistic missile defense, because the threat has evolved, and not just missile defense separate and apart from nuclear and conventional questions. In scope and structure of the review, there's the potential for some significant change, as I've indicated. There will be substantial elements of policy continuity, but also substantial elements of policy change, largely associated with how the high-level policy commitments get implemented in our different regional approaches. With that, let me hope I've left a couple of minutes for some Q&A, and let me reiterate that I'm speaking for myself and not the administration and not anybody with whom I'm affiliated.
Thank you so much. Great.
Thank you.